The Southern Upland Way is 40 years old. It was opened on the 27th of April 1984. This is a brief history of the route, looking back to its earliest days, how the route has changed over the years and what it's like today. We've also put together an exhibition about the history of the route. That's going to be travelling around villages and communities along the route over the next year. So keep an eye out on our Facebook page and our website to find out where that's going to be. People have been walking across Scotland for thousands of years. Of course, for most of this time it would have been a means of transport, often the only way of getting from one place to another. Because the landscape of Scotland would have been dominated by wetlands and forests, and large rivers would have been difficult to cross, the best routes would have become well used and gradually developed into well-worn paths. Of these, one of the best known, certainly in southern Scotland, would be the Pilgrim's Trail from the Central Belt to St Ninian's Cave at Whithorn. The Southern Upland Way runs alongside this as it passes through Kilgallioch Forest, where the Lagingarn standing stones are. These stones are thought to be 4,000 years old, but much later they were carved with Christian crosses by the pilgrims. Gradually, these historic routes would have turned into or been replaced by the drove roads, which were a means of moving cattle to market. The clearances of southern Scotland in the 18th and 19th century led to many people being moved from rural areas. At the same time, the growth of industry in Glasgow and northern England meant a lot of these people ended up living in heavily built-up environments. As a way of escaping from this, walking in the countryside became a popular leisure activity. There are many paths that were created at this time in particularly picturesque locations. There's one at the Yochen Glen just outside Sanquhar with fantastic old bricks lining the sides of the path. It's still a great walk to do today. The same clearances that led to the people being moved from the land meant that it was fenced off as part of improvements to agriculture, and this made access in the countryside increasingly difficult. In 1845, the Association for the Protection of Public Rights of Roadway in and around Edinburgh was formed to protect the public right of access to the countryside in Scotland. They were involved in several key moments in the 19th century, such as the battle for Glen Tilt and the lawsuit over Jock's Road, both of which were essential in establishing the right to walk in the countryside in Scotland. They gradually evolved into the Scottish Rights of Way and Access Society, who are now known as Scotways. In the 19th and early 20th century, the drove roads and hill tracks of Scotland were catalogued and mapped by several people and published in books, which became the first guides to where you could walk in Scotland. Scottish Hill Tracks by D.G. Moyer was published by Scotways in 1947. It includes descriptions of many paths around Scotland with interesting descriptions and simple maps of where they are. It also shows several potential long-distance routes, one of which is remarkably close to the line of the Southern Upland Way. At the same time, England was having its own countryside access revolution. The enclosures were their equivalent of the clearances, and because of the amount of land that was enclosed, the effect on public access to the countryside was possibly even worse. The defining moment was the Kinder mass trespass in 1932, and after many years of campaigning, the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act was passed in 1949. I've already done a video about why public footpaths are marked on maps of England and Wales, but not maps of Scotland, and this act is why. I'll put a link to that video in the description if you want to know more. Another thing that this act did, however, was to make provision for the creation of long-distance footpaths. The first of these was the Pennine Way, which was opened in 1965, and by 1980 there were 8 long-distance footpaths in England and Wales. The The 1949 Act only applies to England and Wales. So a few years later, the Countryside Scotland Act 1967 was passed. This created the Countryside Commission for Scotland, who are now known as Nature Scot. The Act gave them many roles, including the creation of long-distance paths in Scotland. The first of these was the West Highland Way, which opened in 1980, followed by the Speyside Way a year later. And this is where the Southern Upland Way comes into the story. In the mid-70s, as work on the West Highland Way and the Speyside Way was already happening, the Countryside Commission for Scotland decided to explore the possibility of creating long-distance paths in what they described as less rugged parts of the country. The 4 local councils that there were in southern Scotland back then were consulted, and a list of 11 potential routes was put together. This map showing the 11 potential routes comes from the document that was produced to evaluate the paths. The Southern Upland Way is path number 8, although it doesn't show the route that the path follows today. Interestingly, many of the paths shown on here have now become Scotland's great trails, including the Annandale Way, the Berwickshire Coast Path, the Cross Borders Drove Road and the St Cuthbert's Way. Others are currently being developed as new long-distance paths, such as the Clyde Walkway and the South West Scotland Coastal Way. The 11 routes were assessed on a variety of criteria, including the scenery along the route, the wildlife, the history, the climate, what facilities were available for users, what the condition of the path on the ground was already like, and whether there were any problems that would create issues when building the path. The Southern Upland Way scored highly on all of these, except for the climate. The Southern Upland Way was considered the best of all of the routes that were assessed. This was partly because, for the most part, it followed drove roads and existing paths, so it would be fairly easy to implement on the ground, but also because of the impressive nature of the route, which was partly because of the scenery, but also because of the sense of a journey across the country of southern Scotland. Wainwright's book, A Coast to Coast Path, had been published just a few years earlier in 1973, and it was very popular. So the idea of a coast-to-coast path for Scotland was what made them feel the Southern Upland Way was such a good route. On the 13th of July 1979, the Secretary of State for Scotland consented to the creation of the Southern Upland Way, and work began. A lot of the path already existed on the ground. The entire section between Moffat and Galloway was already being promoted as the Borders Walk, and large parts of the rest were on existing drove roads that had been used as walking routes for decades, but there was still a lot of work to do. There were several wide rivers that needed to be crossed, including the Water of Luce at New Luce and the Ken at Dalry. The suspension bridges for these, along with other large projects such as Bothy's, was done by the Army Royal Engineers. There was a great deal of signage that was also needed. Almost 1,000 waymark posts were put in to mark the line of the path. Finger posts were placed at key intersections where the path crosses roads or other trails, and information boards were put at key sites to give details about the path. These have been continuously updated in the 40 years since, though many of them are still in the same locations as they were originally placed, and probably some of the original waymark posts survive to this day. In total, the work to build the path cost £138,000, an amount of money which caused questions to be raised in newspapers about whether it was value for money. The route was officially opened on the 27th of April 1984 by Michael Ancram MP. It was at an event at Tibby Shields Inn on the banks of St Mary's Loch. there's a plaque on the side of the inn today which commemorates the event. In the summer of 1984, a survey was done of people walking the Southern Upland Way. It concluded that in that first year, 2,500 people walked the route from one end to the other. In the 40 years since it's been opened, we think over 40,000 people have completed the route and hundreds of thousands have walked sections of it. Because of the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, you can now do the route on a mountain bike and even do sections of it on horseback. This year, to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Southern Upland Way, we've put together an exhibition about the history of the route. It's going to be launched at an event at the Hive in Glentrool on the 27th of April. It's then going to stay at Glentrool for 2 weeks before moving to the Newton Stewart Walking Festival. It's then going to move around Dumfries and Galloway and the Scottish borders for the rest of the year, so have a look on our website at dgtrails.org to find out where it's going to be. I'm also going to be doing a talk at the Hive and at the Walking Festival and other places in the future about the exciting plans we've got for the future of the Southern Upland Way, so that hopefully in another 40 years' time people will still be exploring this remote wild path through the hills of southern Scotland.